Just joining us. Welcome to Serving Human Trafficking Survivors with Disabilities in Housing. My name is Shakari Dominique, and I will be your moderator for today. Please go ahead and drop your name, organization, anything you would like for us to know about you into the chat. And we're going to get started right here in a few short minutes. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Serving Human Trafficking Survivors with Disabilities in Housing. My name is Shakari Dominique. I will be your moderator for today. We're so glad that you could join us. Please feel free to say hello, drop your name, organization, anything you would like for us to know about you in the chat. All right, so we're going to go ahead and kick it off. Again, you are in Serving Human Trafficking Survivors with Disabilities in Housing. My name is Shakari Dominique, and I'll be your moderator. We're so glad that you can join us today. We are in for an awesome treat from our presenters. And we'll go ahead and get started. Next slide, please. So first, we want to kick off everything with a land acknowledgement. We want to begin by honoring the land we are on today and the indigenous people and communities who have lived and continue to live on these lands. This map you're seeing right now shows the historic territories of many indigenous communities. Take a minute to look up your location using the native lands link that we'll be dropping in the chat, or text the number on the slide, and consider how you can support the indigenous community in your area. Freedom Network is located on the Piscataway people and the Nakashtung people land. So please check that out. Next slide. Okay. This webinar is being brought to you by Freedom Network's Housing Training and Technical Assistance Project, which is funded by Office for Victims of Crime. We provide support and resources to service providers, such as ourselves, for the intersection of housing and human trafficking. Freedom Network USA is a national network of members providing services, advocating for and survivors in the United States. The Housing Project, we host quarterly webinars on topics, again, on the intersection of housing and human trafficking. We provide technical assistance to OVC grantees and their partners. We also have a resource library full of fact sheets and other webinars that you can check out at any time. Feel free to sign up for our listserv to receive notifications on all the things that we're doing here at the Housing Projects. You can find this information in your chat as well. Next slide. Okay, so today I'm going to introduce our speakers. So first we have Wyanette Tasker, who is Lumbian Eastern Band of Cherokee. She was recently the Director of Partnerships and Community Engagement at the Safe Housing Alliance, which strives to ensure that survivors have a full range of safe housing options. She has been working alongside survivors of trafficking since 2005 after graduating from Colorado College with a major in neuroscience. She has direct service provision experience in residential treatment facility, school settings, and disabilities case management. She has been providing tribally and culturally specific training and technical assistance since 2015 through the Red Wing Consulting, with a focus on special survivor populations such as children and youth, males, two-spirit LGBT+, and survivors with disability. She is also the author of multiple projects, including Creating a Safe Space to Grow, a Guide for Tribal Child and Youth Advocacy. Our next presenter is Cynthia Hamadeo. She is the Chief Executive Officer for Barrier Free Living. She is a licensed mental health counselor who specializes in the intersection of domestic violence and disabilities. She regularly presents at domestic violence and trauma conferences nationally to spread awareness of how domestic violence affects people with disabilities. Prior to working with barrier-free living, she counseled children infected and affected by the HIV/AIDS epidemic and survivors of the 2001 World Trade Center attack. She received her master's in education and master's of arts from Teachers College and Columbia University. So these would be our two fantastic speakers providing us with a plethora of information today. Next slide. So today we're going to cover some learning objectives. We will learn some key foundational terms and information on disability justice and housing inclusion for survivors with disabilities, as well as steps to create and incorporate disability inclusive practices to new and existing housing policies and program operations. And we will also be reviewing some case examples to put into practice things that we're learning here today for your housing programs. Next slide. So first, we want to start off by gauging everybody's familiarity with this topic. So we're going to launch a poll. How confident are you in serving survivors with disabilities? So we have pretty confident, we have I know a little bit, we have help, tell me more. So we just want to go by gauging what you all know and what you will be, some of the things that you are familiar with before we get to covering the information. So, and we have some answers coming in right now. So a lot of people are with the I know a little bit. We have a few people that are pretty confident, and we have a good few that says help, tell me more. Okay, next slide. And I will pass it over to our presenters. Enjoy learning.
Hi everyone, welcome today. I'm Cynthia Amadeo. Like Shakira just introduced me, I'm from Barrier Free Living. I just want to tell you a little bit about myself before we begin. I identify as she, her, hers. I am hearing and able-bodied, and I do identify as a person with a disability. Many years ago, I had an accident that resulted in a brain injury, and now I have epilepsy. And I am Barrier Free Living is on Munsee Lenape land. So I'm really excited you're here today to talk about this topic. As we get started, what comes to your mind when you hear disability? You can chat it, you can speak out loud, whatever you feel most comfortable with. Or even what society thinks or says about people with disabilities. And I'll go ahead and I'll read that out loud. Underestimated. Oh, I love that. Thank you. Others? Someone who has difficulty doing daily tasks or completing daily tasks without a type of support. Someone who's unable to care for themselves. Thank you. Think of physical disabilities first. That's right. Anybody else want to share? Societal limitations. People who navigate differently due to physical disability or impairment. Disabilities that can be visible or invisible. Thank you. We're going to talk a lot about that today. That society views people. Oh, you're chatting so fast. Use people as being visible. Yes, as disabilities being visible. Thank you. Can be mental or physical. Someone wrote, I think of all the struggles I had in school with learning disabilities. Thank you for sharing that. Invisible or visible disabilities that may or may not impact their ability to care for themselves. I think this is going to be a great training today. We're already off to a good start. You're all right. A stigma of it being just physical. Thank you. So we're going to talk a lot about invisible and visible disabilities today. We're going to start with the medical model of disability. When we think about disability and people Google it or do a search for it, typically we think about what comes up is the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. The ADA was signed back on July 26, 1990. So For some of us, that was not that long ago. And the purpose of the ADA is to ensure that people of all abilities have equal access to opportunity. And it prevents discrimination in employment opportunities, government participation, public accommodation, commercial facilities, transportation, and telecommunications, just like the platform that we're on today, Zoom. So we're going to go over the 3 bullet points here that the ADA looks at to determine if someone has a disability. Now, it's important to keep in mind, I am a mental health counselor. I am not a lawyer, folks. There are lawyers that specifically work in this area to ensure access and compliance with the ADA. So this is just coming from my experience as a mental health counselor. So there's 3 points that we look at. The first is that someone has a physical or mental impairment. Those are the words of the ADA, not of barrier-free living, that substantially limits one or more major life activity. So what is a major life activity? You can chat it, you can speak out loud. This is going to be interactive. Someone wrote meeting the ADLs. That's right. And ADLs means activities of daily living. So let's talk about that a little bit more. What is an ADL, an activity of daily living? Transportation. Yep. So being able to commute and get around. Others? Think about what you do every day. Eating, hygiene, being able to bathe. Yes. Others? Communication, being able to speak. Working. Yes. Managing finances, yes, being able to manage your budget on your own. Daily life tasks, life skills. You're all right. How about seeing? Hearing? Eating? Walking? There's some things that we do as able-bodied and hearing individuals that we don't even think about, like being able, like I can be able to get up right now and walk. But for some, that's a little bit more difficult to do. Or they don't have that skill set because of their limitations. So for me, as a person with epilepsy, that means commuting. The government is very serious about giving people with epilepsy a driver's license. So after my accident, for example, I did not have a driver's license, but then I wanted to get one. It took me 5 years to get my driver's license, not because I failed the test, but because I needed to prove not only to my doctor, but also to the government that I was a capable individual. So I have a driver's license, but there's limitations on that. I agreed with my doctor, because he trusts me, that I'm allowed to drive locally in my town. Like I can go pick up my kids from school, I can go to the supermarket, but I can't go on a highway. So if I need to take my child to an activity that involves getting on a highway, I need to find alternative transportation for him. Maybe that means asking someone or getting in a taxi. So that's how that affects me in my life. And that looks different for everyone. Now, being in New York City, that's not so much, it doesn't affect my life that much because I have lots of transportation options, having the buses and the subways, taxis readily available. Now, if I lived in different parts of the country, or if I went upstate to New York or in other counties in New York, my life may look a little different about how having epilepsy affects my being able to commute to places. So sometimes these things will be impacted by where you live and the environment that you're in. Any questions or comments? I'm going to check the chat. Yeah, someone says rural America. Yeah, it would be a little bit difficult for me to live in places like that. Someone writes, speaking of access, oh, if anyone would like to use the closed captioning, you can press the closed captioning button. Okay. So the second bullet point is a record of an impairment. An example of that is someone who had cancer and now they're in remission and they're requesting accommodation from their job to be able to go to their annual doctor's appointment. So they no longer have cancer, but they have the record of it, and it qualifies them for the accommodation for their job to go to their doctor's appointment. Not everyone has sick time that they can utilize. And the third point is someone who's regarded as having an impairment. That's someone who's deaf or hearing, or hard of hearing, sorry. So for that community, for some individuals, they don't consider consider themselves disabled. It's a culture. So they have access under the ADA, under language, but they don't consider themselves as disabled. They're regarded as having impairment, so they have language access under the ADA. Any questions so far? Okay. Does anyone see a trend in this? We're talking about the medical model. What makes it a medical model of the definition of disability? It's that we're looking at what the person themselves can and cannot do. It's very individualized. So a little fun on this afternoon. Anybody know who the person is on the side with the icon shirt? You can chat it or speak out loud. Cher, yes. So Cher has dyslexia and ADHD. Who's the person in the middle? Halle Berry, yes. So Halle Berry has type 1 diabetes. She was diagnosed after spending 7 days in a diabetic coma and woke up in the hospital. And the last icon, Maya Angelou. Yeah, there's a lot going on in the chat right now. Everyone knows her. So she had selective mutism. She was completely silent for 5 years after being abused by her mother's boyfriend. So I show these pictures to say that there's many people in our society that we look up to, and they have disabilities, but we don't see them as people with disabilities. They're invisible, and as a society, we tend just not to talk about them. Okay, so we're going to talk about types of disabilities. Now, this is not like an all-inclusive list. There's lots of different types out there, but it's to give you an idea of what could be. And we talked a little bit in the chat about visible and invisible. So we're going to talk about that today. Someone wrote in the chat that Halle Berry also has a hearing disability from a TBI due to DV. I did not know that. Thank you. So let's start with deaf or hard of hearing. Now, keep in mind, like I said earlier, people who are deaf or hard of hearing may or may not consider themselves medically deaf, or they may consider themselves culturally deaf. So someone who grows up in a household where they come from a deaf family, they go to deaf schools, they consider themselves culturally deaf. Someone who's latent deaf, meaning maybe they're getting older and they lose their hearing, maybe it's because of an accident that they have, that they lost their hearing, they may consider themselves medically deaf and not part of the culture. There's only one way to know this, and that's to ask the person. There are people who have blind visual issues, such as blind or vision loss. You can't always tell by looking at the person. Sometimes they have a walking stick or a seeing eye dog, but there are individuals who may have contact lenses and they're legally blind. So you can't assume anything about someone just by what you see. Just because I wear glasses doesn't mean that I may fall into the category of legally blind. I'm not. But I may be, depending on how bad my vision was. Someone wrote in the chat, big D and little D's. Yes, thank you. So they're referring to being culturally deaf or medically deaf, and that has to do with the way we write about deafness. Thank you. There could be physical or medical conditions, and in the chat earlier, we said that this is typically what we think about when we hear disability. So there's a whole list of medical conditions that someone may have. And here I just want to say that there's a whole spectrum, right? We can have asthma and maybe I take my pump once a year when it's cold outside and we're all good. Or I can have like COPD and everything in between. And there's a lot of this when it comes to different medical conditions. Sometimes they progress with time and sometimes they can get better. And there are things that we can live with and we're good, but some days they're worse than other days. So it's important to keep in mind when we're thinking about physical and medical conditions. There is psychiatric and mental health that is a disability. As a society, we tend to put it in a different bucket. I don't know why we do, but psychiatric and mental health is a disability. So it could be depression. Again, it could be something like a low-lying depression where I'm getting up, I'm dressing, I'm bathing, I'm going to work, but it's just a constant sadness that I'm always feeling. I'm suicidal, everything in between. And then there are neurodevelopmental, cognitive, intellectual disabilities, such as learning disabilities, autism spectrum disabilities, motor disorders, speech disorders. So there's a lot of different areas when we talk about disability. So it's hard to say there's one bucket because there's so many different areas of what it looks like. And it's very individual for each person. And here I also want to talk about the label of disability. You might hear people call themselves differently. So when I first had my accident, for a long time, I said, I have a medical condition called epilepsy, because I was uncomfortable with the label of disability. That made me feel a certain way because of what society says about people with disability. It took me time to get comfortable with that label and what that meant for me as a person. Now I'm proud, I'm happy, I'm excited. I'm like, yes, this is my label. It is who I am. But it took me a minute to get there. So it's really up to the person how they want to describe themselves. Someone wrote in the chat, grieving a past self. Yeah. When you have an accident, it does, when you go from fine to not fine almost overnight, that is a very difficult place to be in. And for our survivors, think about that, because there could be an accident that happened to them that it put them in a different place in their life, or it can be a medical condition, right, that now progressed suddenly. Someone wrote in the chat, I've never considered myself as having a disability before, but I have depression problem and a small learning disability. Yeah, and it's okay. It's all about how you feel comfortable in talking about yourself and talking about who you are as a person. That's very personal to individuals. So that's why when I talk about the ADA and your rights as to accommodations, that's it's how what society will label it as, but that differs from who I am as a person and how I want to label myself. Okay, I'm gonna go to try to go to the next slide. Okay. So I really like this quote from an author. Her name is Lois Peath. I'm gonna say it, I'm gonna speak it out loud. You can read it, whatever you feel most comfortable with. Doing disability all day long can be an exhausting process. I don't mean having an impairment. In my own case, not being able to walk. Like most disabled people, I can deal with this. I mean, having to spend a significant part of each day dealing with the physical world, which is historically designed to exclude me, and even more tiring, dealing with other people's misconceptions about me. So I want you to just sit with that for a minute as we talk about the medical model of disability. And we as a society, we really have a lot of beliefs about what disability means. And as a person with a disability, this quote really resonated with me because after the accident, one of my issues that I didn't want to say the word disability was because of all the stereotypes out in the world and what it meant to say I have a disability and how people were going to view me in the various parts of my life as a parent, as a woman, as an executive, and work. What did all that mean? Okay. There's someone who said, same, I went through all this after my accident. Thank you for sharing that. Okay. So the definition that we like to use at Barrier-Free Living has to do with from the World Health Organization. You can look it up. It is a very long, complicated document, just like the ADA. But so I'm taking a piece of it and we're going to talk about it. So the World Health Organization describes disability as not just a health problem, as a complex phenomenon reflecting the interaction between the features of a person's body and the features of the society in which he or she lives. Overcoming the difficulties faced by people with disabilities requires interventions to remove environmental and social barriers. So when we start to look at disability from the social perspective, we start looking at it as us as a society and no longer about what the person themselves can and cannot do. So I'm going to give you an example, and then you can give me some other examples of what this means in our world that we live in today. Does everyone know those little push buttons that in big stores you go to, you hit the button and the doors magically open? We all love it, right? Especially during COVID, none of us wanted to grab the handles and touch doors. So we all like hit it with our elbow. That's an example of how society shifted and changed. That push button is an accessibility device for universal access. So people who can't open the door or need a little assistance with the door, that they push the button and they can go through. For society, we said, this is fantastic, I love it. And now you see it everywhere. And we get a little bit mad when the push button doesn't work or if it takes too long to open. So that's an example of how society shifted and changed, and how something that started as an accessibility accommodation now has become part of our normal life. Do you have any other examples of that? Bumps on the ground leaving a store, yes. I think you're talking about the curb cuts and entering parking lots. Yes, that started as an accessibility feature. So people who had an accessibility device like a wheelchair or a walker, they were able to cross the street or get onto a sidewalk. But we love it because when we have strollers or in New York, we use a lot of carts to put our groceries in. So we get upset when we don't see a curb cut, or some of us like to bike and we get upset when we don't have a curb cut there. Vibration on our phones was created for the deaf. Yes, that's a great example. And we love that in society. I mean, we hear it all the time now. So put your phone on vibrate, please, so you don't interrupt people. We use it all the time. There's another comment that there's the bumps that let a blind person know that they're entering into traffic, yellow, and several rows. Yes, I do that all the time with my kids. I tell them, stop at the bumps. That's like where that's a safe place to stop at. And I know lots of other people do that too. Talk to text. Oh my gosh, that is a great example that we do use that a lot, as it was started as an accommodation feature and now everyone loves it. Closed captioning. I don't watch TV without it. Yes. Now on certain devices, you can hit the little button and say, what did she say? And it'll go back 15 seconds, and it'll come up with the closed captioning for those 15 seconds. So you get the point of how things started as accommodations, and as we as a society shifted and changed, and now we have universal access in certain areas in our world. Voice activated tech, yes. So technology is advancing and it's great, but there's certain areas in our life that maybe is not so acceptable still. That we have features of accessibility, but society is like, I don't know about that. I'm going to give you the example of the bus. I'm in the city, so we take the bus a lot. You know how sometimes a person with a wheelchair gets on the bus stops, you need to have the ramp open and close. Does anyone know what happens on the bus? What you hear on the bus from people? Or imagine? Keep groaning. Yes, thank you. People are annoyed. How long is this going to take? Now I'm going to be late. People get upset when they have to move. Yes. They're like, oh, I was standing here. This was my spot. So that's a feature of society. It's a feature that's accessible, but society has not really caught on and said, we accept this. Okay. So there's
Hi.
a knowledge, go ahead.
Yeah. Sorry. Hi, everyone. I'm Wynette. As we kind of transition into the next segment, we have a quick pop quiz. So what are some forms of disabilities? Please go ahead and chat those in. Mental, developmental, learning, cognitive, acquired, physical, neurodevelopmental, physical, medical, neurological, learning, behavioral, social, learning, cognition, brain injuries, also known as traumatic brain injuries, TBIs, as a result of violence, deaf, hard of hearing, hearing impairment, visual impairment, trauma. Yeah, thank you, everyone. Medical. Awesome. And then I would just kind of add into kind of circling back to the visible and invisible and the stigmas around invisible and visible. There's different stigmas attached to those. So thinking about invisible disabilities, my husband right now needs a total hip replacement. He walks with a cane. He has the placard for his car to be able to park closer to locations. But when our kids are with him, they're constantly telling him go sit in the car while we go put groceries in the trunk so that people don't harass you because you look too mobile. And so there's definitely an awareness all around of that stigma. And this is a temporary thing for him and a very new thing for our children to be kind of concerned about. So that's been interesting to see them respond in that way. All right, next slide. So we'll kind of shift into all of these different intersections. So the intersections of disability, along with housing, along with human trafficking. Next slide.
I'm just going to give you a few stats as to why this is so important. Why are we here talking about this today? So there's a study done back in April of 2017 that people with disabilities are 3 times more likely to experience rape, sexual assault, aggravated assault, and robbery than those without a disability. The mere presence of a disability greatly increases your risk of violent victimization, whether a victim identifies as male or female. And in a study done in 2010 to 14 by the National Crime Victimization Study, they found that people with disabilities were over 3 times more likely to experience serious violent crime, which includes rape, sexual assault, aggravated assault, and robbery. So this is a very important issue to the disability population because many of us have experienced a violent victimization at some point in our life, and receiving services can be difficult at times. So it's really important that as service providers, we have an awareness about what the needs are around for people with disabilities, so we can work towards universal access.
So keep in mind that survivors may have disabilities before or as a result of trafficking. And someone in the chat mentioned the traumatic brain injuries, which can cause a huge range of different symptoms. So thinking about things like headaches, speech problems, blurred vision, light and sound sensitivity, different kind of memory issues, seizures, coordination difficulties, weakness and numbness in different parts of the body, hearing issues. Someone in the chat said forgetfulness, yes. And then a lot of people don't really connect with disabilities, including mental health. But I will say that I've worked in HUD, the Housing and Urban Development programs, and even through HUD programs, mental health is considered a disability, and for disability-specific housing programs, mental health is an eligible disability. Definitely be cautious around different labels and diagnoses. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is a really great example because mental health issues can be a result of trauma or disabilities, a mix. So something that you can do with each other during your staff meetings or different kind of gatherings, if you're all back in the office and those kind of things, you can do it on Zoom too, because we'll do it here in a second. Have everyone at your organization bring like some sort of label, positive, negative labels. It's up to you all and what you individually want to bring. Diagnoses, controversial things that survivors have experienced. And then take turns going around, and like each person will read their prompt and the others will kind of write down the first thing that pops in their head. And then you don't have to share that with each other, but you can kind of process through anything that came up while you're doing it. So we'll kind of do that real quick here. So the first thing that you think about when you think about survivors who are aggressive, if you could chat that in, that would be great. So survivors who are aggressive, I'm saying defense mechanism, fight or flight instinct, defensiveness, survival, unheard. What needs do they have that aren't being met? The issue may not be the issue. Hurt, pain, trauma response, needs and boundaries, reacting out of pain. What they may be going through today. Adverse childhood experiences or ACEs. Boundaries. Fight or flight. They respond to what they know. Attention, racism. Okay, so what about survivors that have PTSD symptoms? So post-traumatic stress disorder. Survivors who have PTSD. Trauma triggers. Dissociation. Startle response. No trust with anyone or any agencies. Anxiety and depression. Isolation, walls up. Reactive, hard to open up. Misunderstood. Startles easily, paranoia, high risk behavior. Okay, what about survivors who have autism? Can't focus, sensory overload, communication limitations, maybe sensitive to touch, touch averse. Stimming. And Rachel, if you could explain to everyone what stimming is. Guarded, sound sensitivity. we're not understanding what they're trying to communicate. And Rachel, thank you. So Rachel is saying stimming is reaction, mostly repetitive.
Wynette, I see someone has their hand up. Michelle.
Oh, thank you. And someone from Freedom Network, are we able to take them off mute? I'm not even sure. Okay, I'm seeing we can't actually take you off of mute. Apologies. But you can message directly with questions. So an example of stimming I'm seeing in the chat is like making noises and tapping. Someone said swimming is a way folks calm themselves when they're overloaded. Someone said self-soothing techniques. I'm seeing any survivor can experience these trauma responses, but for people with developmental disabilities, this is typically reframed as a disability-related or difficulties with self-regulation, and someone steps in with a behavioral plan rather than trauma healing options. Behavior is communication. Awesome. Thank you for doing that with me. So then if you do this as a group, you can also do this now. Process how that felt. If anything came up for you that felt uncomfortable, anything that surprised you that you thought of, because these are really good things to do to bring in awareness to what you have kind of in the back of your mind about survivors who come in for services. So I tend to hear a lot with PTSD, the flashbacks. And I remember when I first started going to therapy, I was like, I don't have flashbacks. Is that weird? And they were like, no, it's totally fine that you don't have flashbacks. But in my head, in order to qualify as having PTSD, I had to have flashbacks. And so that was in my mind. So caution around those labels and kind of what ideas that society has around them and what we individually can carry forward. I've always heard people talk about the first thought is kind of that back of mind thought, and then your second thought is, your frontal lobe kicking in and how you really feel about the words or the phrases or the diagnoses, things like that. So it's interesting if you're doing this as a group to kind of process through that. And I'm seeing, I use that word a lot just from dealing with heavy work. Yeah, we get, vicarious trauma, we get burnout, we get compassion fatigue. The work is hard. And we're talking about housing today. Housing was bad pre-COVID and is just getting worse and worse. And so housing is really difficult. This is difficult work. Trafficking work can be really heavy. So yeah, definitely protect yourselves, do your self-care. And I'm seeing like, don't throw around certain terms casually. Like, oh my gosh, I have PTSD from this person, when it's not PTSD, it's that you're stressed out, that the person was, you were getting that kind of compassion fatigue from it. And I'm seeing a comment about constant paranoia, thinking everyone is going to steal their identity, is bugging them or listening in somehow. I feel helpless when they can't trust me due to those issues. Yeah. It's so invalidating to hear regarding PTSD, especially as a survivor working in this movement. I try to tell advocates, like, it's not personal. It's not personal, but it definitely feels personal. I get it. It feels personal. But like, I was someone who went to go get help. I'm a survivor of childhood sexual abuse. And at like 18, when I knew I could sign a lease, finally, I went to go get help. Couldn't get help. Was not offered anything besides basically told to go away. And so I have this past systems involvement that I bring with me. So you could do everything right, but still I remember the people who didn't help me from forever ago. So there are definitely things that could come out of me that I'm projecting onto you that are not about you at all. So all right, next slide. Okay, we'll go through some legal protections pretty quickly. For this presentation, it's really about you getting an idea of some different protections if you want to dig deeper. So TVPA, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, it's from 2000, and it was created to bring out new tools and new resources to eliminate trafficking. And it also established the 3 Ps, which are protection, prevention, and prosecution. Cynthia talked a little bit about the Americans with Disabilities Act. So that was originally in 1990, and it's a civil rights law that is prohibiting discrimination based on disabilities. The next one is the Rehabilitation Act, or Rehab Act. And that one prohibits discrimination based on disabilities. And this one is really about federal components. So programs conducted in federal agencies, programs receiving federal funds, federal employment, and then the employment practices of any federal contractors. The Olmstead, are there legal protections and housing equity protections for survivors going through evictions? Yes. There's going to be a mix of things that can come into play here. And so knowing about federal laws, local laws, tenant rights, VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act, can help survivors with evictions, especially when their evictions are caused by the perpetrator. Those kind of protections definitely come into play. Concerningly, the past couple of years, we've been hearing a lot about nuisance ordinances, which is basically survivors call the police because their trafficker found them and is trying to break down their door or something like that. After the police have come out a certain amount of times, landlords are trying to evict, saying that the survivor is being a nuisance. And so there's a lot of work around protections for survivors in those situations. So nuisance ordinances are increasingly, with the housing market as bad as it is, they're increasingly becoming more common because landlords and property managers and property owners are able in this situation to be discriminatory and still know that they can fill their unit. In different housing climates, they would be more worried about that vacancy, but right now they're not. So there are definitely protections though, and ways to advocate for those. Olmstead versus LC, that one eliminated unnecessary segregation. And so it's ensuring that services are the most integrated that's appropriate for someone with disabilities, their needs. So as an example, I worked in special education, and like 7 out of 8 of their classes were in the general classrooms, and then their like homework was modified, things like that, so that they weren't segregated into one classroom all day. They went to all of the classes that everyone else at the school went to. And then where am I? So like program statutes establish protected classes and anti-discrimination around that. So VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act, their language is around prohibiting grantees from excluding, denying benefits, discriminating against any person on the basis of actual or perceived. And then there's protected classes. So race, color, religion, national origin, sex, gender, sexual orientation, and disabilities. So the thing with the Violence Against Women Act is even if you're getting $1 from VAWA, it applies. And also for the DOJ, the Department of Justice, for people getting any DOJ funding, you're also required to provide those reasonable accommodations that were talked about. And we'll talk more about those too. The caveat to reasonable accommodations is this: unless there is an undue hardship that would fundamentally alter services. And we can talk about that more too. This is just kind of a primer for that conversation. But every case is definitely individualized. And every person with a disability is an individual. We don't want to think about homogeneously putting people into these buckets where we do think about, oh, someone has autism, therefore they all STEM, those kind of things. We definitely want to make sure that all of the accommodations, all of the services are very much individualized to meet everyone's needs. Okay, next slide. And I'm seeing in the chats, it can be helpful to link up with local housing unions or housing defense programs, but we have to train them up on trauma-informed care before we start referring clients. Absolutely. So reasonable accommodations, I'm going to drop in the chat. A website, and it's called Ask Jan, so askjan.org. Early into working on the national level, I found this, and it was helpful for me to think about what kind of reasonable accommodations are even out there or examples. And I liked this one because you can search by disabilities, by limitations, by topics, by accommodations. So just like recognize that this is for like work-related situations, but there are places online that can give you ideas on reasonable accommodations and things that you can start doing and thinking about. I'm seeing in the chat, so true about training different partners on trauma-informed care before you start referring. And offering special or specific trainings to organizations working with survivors and sex workers. Okay, so according to the ADA, reasonable accommodation is alterations to policies, to practices, to procedures that allow people with disabilities to enjoy the same services, to have access to the same services as people who don't have disabilities. And these accommodations have to be made unless it's a significant difficulty or expense. This undue hardship is absolutely subjective. So it's kind of based on a lot of factors. So possibly the cost of the accommodation, the resources that the facility has. It can be, the number of people who are employed at the facility, the effect of the expenses on the facility and the programming, the size of the organization, the type of organization, location, kind of the structure of the building. So I've done a lot of rural work. And so an example from rural programs is I've seen a lot of advocates who are kind of working in trailers. And so their advocacy program is in a trailer. So it might not really be feasible for them to like build a ramp for someone with a wheelchair. But one of the few things about COVID that was good is that it normalized mobile advocacy, meeting survivors where they are. So I think that the more advocates can kind of get out and about in the community, the better. So if you can bring your programming and yourself to survivors, that's always a good thing. So being creative about reasonable accommodations, listening to survivors about what they need, thinking through them, and, engage in a conversation with good faith, and trusting that survivors are the experts in their own lives. Any questions so far? Someone said, love that idea of mobile services. I don't want anyone to feel chained to their desks. First of all, it brings in this weird power and control dynamic that I have a desk and you don't, and I have the keys and you don't. I worked at shelter and housing programs, and it was always staff who use power control tactics, which is really re-victimizing, with this aspect of, well, I have the keys. Yeah, it's very strange to see. So I love mobile services to be more interactive, to meet survivors where they're at, and kind of get rid of that dynamic of the office and the formality of the office and the structure of the office that can be really intimidating and off-putting to certain people. All right, next slide. And so shifting into service provision and supports. Advocacy. I say advocacy a lot. Other people say like victim service provider, so VSPs, however you want to refer to that. I just call it advocacy. But so survivors, even survivors without disabilities, but in particular survivors with disabilities, are super unlikely to self-refer for services. I don't think a single time when I was working at the shelter, I had someone come up to me and say, I'm a trafficking survivor. I did have a lot of people disclose, I've been sexually assaulted over and over and over, or I've been exchanging sexual favors for a hotel stay or a meal, things like that. But then with survivors who have disabilities, you also think about things like the lack of access, difficulties getting that communication across, and also an unawareness of community resources. Working in special education, I absolutely knew that these students who were in special ed were not invited to health classes as much as math classes. They were not receiving the same kind of healthy relationships and boundaries and all of the things that go into health classes or could go into health classes that the other students were receiving. They really weren't educated about different resources, different red flags. So there's definitely a barrier there that even schools put up. So ask about what support they want or need from you. Everyone has different ideas about how intervention and service provision should go, which might conflict with the needs and wants of survivors. So it's super important to remember that survivors and even survivors with disabilities may not want services, and that's their decision. As always, we respect that. We offer options. They are the experts in their own lives. So we can help with problem solving. We can help with safety planning. We can help with reasonable accommodations. But ultimately, if they're like, no, I don't want this, that's obviously up to them, you know. Assumptions, we went through that quick kind of bias check and what we think about when we hear different words. So just remember that caution around the labels and our own biases and different ideas that we carry about different labels. It's always good practice to avoid using jargon, to avoid using acronyms, and to speak more concretely than these abstract terms. Just in general, it's good practice. And then when you do use acronyms, definitely explain them and make sure they're really clear. We have so many acronyms in our field. Even going from like housing to survivor services, there's totally different languages spoken. So yeah, definitely pay attention to that. And someone in the chat said, I hate acronyms. Get an unbiased interpreter, not a caregiver. We know that there's family trafficking where family members are the perpetrators. So caregivers are not necessarily safe. They also are not necessarily translating in a trauma-informed way, using the right kind of terminology to explain it in an understandable way. So definitely make sure that you are actually paying interpreters, getting people who can do the job in an unbiased way. And then also keep in mind to not look at the interpreter, to look at the survivor when you're having these conversations. You don't have to be an expert. You know, do your homework, be respectful, be creative, be open and ready to learn. It's really about building that relationship and building trust and you learning. But definitely don't use the knowledge as kind of a, well, I don't know this, so I'm going to refer you out. Same with trafficking. There are a lot of service providers that I've seen who refer out because they don't really feel comfortable. But then what happens to survivors is that they just kind of get shuffled around and shuffled around and shuffled around until they stop seeking help. So we don't want people to just kind of get tossed out. It's okay to not know everything. It's really okay. Build those relationships, learn more. And I'm really glad that you're all here so that you can learn more. Explain rights. So like the Americans with Disabilities Act, things like that. Your confidentiality practices, but it's also good to know your partner's confidentiality practices. So I'm going to do a warm handoff, which is a referral, but not just giving you a business card and saying, hey, call this person. We're going to do it together if you want. We can call them on the phone together. And then we're going to talk about their confidentiality before you walk into an unsafe situation. So knowing your partner's confidentiality practices is also awesome. And then grievance policies. Survivors, all survivors, should be able to file grievances when they feel like their rights have been violated. And it's good for you to address those things. And to have someone unbiased who's going to address those things, as difficult as that can be. But it can really lead to positives at your organization. New policies, new procedures, more training. Grievance policies don't have to be a bad thing. Look at it as opportunities. Oh, also mandatory reporting when we're thinking about confidentiality. So definitely know your responsibilities when it comes to vulnerable adults, or however your jurisdiction defines people with disabilities. And then reevaluate how you're doing education, your outreach, your relationship building strategies. And I have a link to drop into the chat. This is from Vera. Oh no, I think I just pasted and sort of copied. Okay, yes. So vera.org. This is a resource that they have to think through your capacity to serve survivors with disabilities. They have a lot of really great resources. Okay, next slide. Safety planning. When we think about safety planning, we want to make sure that it's holistic. So thinking about physical safety, mental safety, emotional safety, physical, mental, emotional, spiritual safety, technological safety, safety during transportation, different kind of safety measures that we think about. Safety planning, we really want to think about that balance. So we're trying to build in some kind of harm reduction strategies. So if this happens, this could be a possible way to reduce harm. So thinking about those caregivers who could be a really great resource for safety planning when they know how to respond, or caregivers could not be safe, and we need to think about safety planning around caregivers. Like, let's say someone has a new caregiver. How can we safety plan until you've built a relationship and you feel comfortable with that person? And maybe that's just your emotional safety on how to feel emotionally okay with a new person in your life. It could be something like that. Transportation, Cynthia brought up being on the bus. I live in a big city and we still don't have public transportation. Everybody votes it down all the time. And so even our children have to, parents have to pay for children to take the buses to school here. So we really don't have very much public transportation. But if the perpetrators are also using this transportation to target people, then transportation is not necessarily safe. School settings, so can also be a positive or negative as far as safety planning goes. Schools can definitely take sides. They can have those biases that are built into society about survivors not being believed, that pervasive myth around false reporting, that survivors are attention seekers and they're just lying. And then it's amplified for survivors of trafficking who have disabilities too. And so schools can be an issue, or schools can be very great about safety planning, and they can watch for things, and they can know how to alert certain people when certain things happen. Emotional safety planning, thinking about triggers and how we're going to respond to triggers. It might just be something quick, like you keep lavender on you, and when you're feeling triggered, you smell some lavender. Access and reasonable accommodations or modifications in housing. So this is when we're talking about HUD, the housing and urban development kind of housing, with this coordinated entry. Coordinated entry is this entryway to be assessed and placed in HUD housing. However, HUD documentation and tracking wasn't designed for survivors. It was not built for survivors' confidentiality, for safety. So your local COC, which is your continuum of care, is the entity or organization or group of people who would be great to partner with on this, so that you can open up safe access by making changes to the ways that survivors can interact with that system. Landlords and neighbors, again, can be a positive or a threat. Some landlords and neighbors are really great and they can watch out for certain things. And then some landlords and neighbors are not safe. And you need to safety plan to protect from whatever they're doing. We definitely want to make sure that with safety planning that people don't feel like they can't engage in the activities they were already doing before. And it's great to open it up to new activities too. Abuse thrives in isolation. So we still want them to be able to do community activities or do more community activities, really like bring in a new social network. I'm seeing our COC is great because they can give anonymous initials and be an interested other if there are difficulties getting in touch with a survivor. That's great. Okay, think about their strengths, their abilities, any kind of health related needs, how they can access medications if they need to flee, or devices. Might think about respite care if they're in something like a host home for adults with disabilities. They might be living in a host home, and there are respite care providers for them to be at short term. And then benefits. Traffickers know that people with disabilities might have like Social Security benefits that they are interested in taking. All right, next slide. Okay, the big thing about this one is that cultural healing is at the core of trauma recovery. So when thinking about cultural supports and healing, this is so critical, and it's a piece that gets overlooked and gets missed when it's really, really critical as far as this holistic view of who we are as humans. You might need some accommodations, assisted technology, but make access to cultural supports a priority. There's ways within cultural supports to build in resiliency factors, like those connections, the sense of belonging, and it can all be fostered through this. Be persistent with your partnerships, because you don't have to be an expert on all things. No one expects you to be an expert on all things. Compensate expertise. If you have volunteers, compensate them. And think through those accommodations. So for example, if you're doing some sort of talking circle, or I've been in beading groups, or if you're doing outdoor activities like gardening, how you could do reasonable accommodations there. Next slide.
All right, thank you so much for that. So talking about culture leads us into language. Language is extremely important, and when we're talking about and with people. So it's really important that we're putting the person before the disability. So example, if you were talking about me as Cynthia, you would say, Cynthia is here to see you, and by the way, she has a disability called epilepsy. You wouldn't say the person with a disability, she has epilepsy, she's here to see you, and by the way, her name is Cynthia. So that's an example that we're putting the person first, not their disability. And I really want you to think about this as how you're documenting in your notes and such, but how you're writing about people. It's not just how we're verbally talking with people, it's also our documentation as well, because those documents can go to court and there can be implications about how we're writing about folks. So there's some language that we hear every day, and there's some that are more affirmative and there's some that's outdated. So for example, we prefer the terms deaf or hard of hearing. The terminology deaf mute, deaf dumb, and hearing impaired, that's outdated language. That's preferable that we do not use. The most common that I hear is hearing impaired, but the word impair implies that there's a problem, right? And in the deaf community, particularly those who identify within the deaf culture, they see it as something to be very proud about. It's not a problem. So when you start, you see how that word impair really changes the context of the conversation. So it's deaf or hard of hearing. People are wheelchair users. They're not wheelchair bound or confined to the wheelchair. They are able to get out of the wheelchair. We prefer the terminology person with psychiatric disability or person with cognitive or intellectual disability. We do not use the words crazy anymore, retarded, or mentally defective. And even some of our language that we use in the world, some of the old documentation does have this in their formal form still. But it doesn't mean that's what society should be using, and how we're being mindful about how we're documenting. And it's preferred person with physical disability, though language crippled or deformed is not what we prefer anymore. Okay, so I think we talked a lot about this already, but just a few key things to really kind of keep in mind is that you ask before you help, please. Always don't assume you know what the person needs just because you worked with someone who is deaf before, someone who was blind before. Every individual has their individual needs. Please be sensitive about physical contact, especially with the population that we're serving. Don't go behind someone who's a wheelchair user and start pushing their wheelchair. That's like pushing them. That's the same concept. Don't lean on their wheelchair. That's like leaning on their shoulder. Like Wynette said earlier, please speak directly to the person that you're serving. Don't talk to their caregiver, ask them questions. So I'll give a simple example of lunch. Don't ask Wynette what I want for lunch. Ask me. I'm standing right here. I can answer my own questions. Please be patient. Sometimes it takes a little bit more time to get through certain things, but please take your time. Don't make assumptions and be mindful of your language. Okay.
I'm seeing in the chat, I've experienced more rudeness from persons with disabilities. Can you say more about that? And I'm seeing sit across from a person in wheelchair during conversation, not standing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, here's some best practices. Long-term housing is awesome. Permanent supported housing is one that's through HUD, in particular, the Housing and Urban Development. And they have this program, PSH, that is specifically for people with disabilities who are chronically homeless. Of the different types of survivor types, I will say for my own experience that trafficking survivors tend to be more likely to be chronically homeless than like domestic violence survivors. So I've had pretty good chances of survivors qualifying for this type of HUD programming with that chronically homeless, just because of what they had been through. Educational materials all around the community, doctors' offices, community centers, survivors engaged in the leadership, the feedback, the guidance, the input. I talked about the warm handoffs, making sure that it's not just handing someone a business card and sending them on their way. Relationship building, partnerships, reasonable accommodations, and then policies around regular trainings. When you have staff turnover, you don't want all of that knowledge lost. Next slide. Here's a list of some possible partnerships, but definitely include survivors. Survivors are needed. Their voices are critical. So in leadership positions, in hiring practices, in advisory councils, every step of the way, make sure that you're involving survivors. And next slide.
Okay. So when you talk about possible accommodations, we tend to think of things that are very costly, like elevators and ramps, right? But there's lots of things that we can do every single day that are very low cost or don't cost any money at all. So for example, reading material aloud and slowly, that costs nothing. And this is what I talk about when I talk about universal access and society shifting and changing. So instead of just handing someone a piece of paper and saying sign, let's read out loud what the document says, and then we're going to point to where to sign. If the person is unable to see where you're pointing, we may need to guide their hand where to sign. So it's changing our practices sometimes to create access. Don't assume that someone can read and write. And by doing that, now I'm putting someone in a comfortable position of not having to disclose to me, I don't understand this document. Because now I'm already said to them, I'm going to read it out loud to you, and I do this for everybody. So I'm going to, if you have questions along the way, just stop me and let me know. Please allow the person to take breaks, especially when we're talking about people who've been hit in the head multiple times or have brain injuries. Sometimes we don't know that, but it can be exhausting retelling your story over and over again. And sometimes we need to be mindful for ourselves as the service provider that we need to take breaks in between. We have a saying at Barrier Free Living that the paperwork is our problem, not the survivors. That we're the ones who have to get through the paperwork because we need to get things done in a timely manner. But we want to do it in a way that's most comfortable to our survivors. Please remind people of appointments. We have a lot going on. And I know that it's hard sometimes to take those few moments out of your day and give a call to someone. I know some of our systems are able to give like text reminders, but those reminders are really helpful, especially when we have a lot going on in our lives, just the day-to-day. But now we have the trauma piece, right? And maybe we have some medical conditions that we're also dealing with. So a courtesy reminder is super helpful. In places like this, and I made the mistake just now, I didn't say my name, Cynthia speaking. Please just say it's Cynthia. So particularly it's important for people who can't see in group meetings, it's important that you're able to say your name and say, hey, it's Cynthia, blah, blah, blah. And everyone says their name prior to speaking if you can't see who's in the space. We talked about looking directly at the interpreter. No, don't look directly at the interpreter, at the person you're serving instead of the caregiver or interpreter. And it's okay to just say, do you need any accommodations? You can simply ask, is it on your paperwork or is it in your intake paperwork? When we start asking about name and birth date and gender, does it say, do you need any accommodations? So that's your homework for today. Go back to your paperwork. And if it's not there, maybe you can advocate because you're putting it out there to the world. When you ask the question, I see you, I hear you, I want you to be in this space. How can we help you and meet your needs? So there's someone in the chat says, how do you manage if someone doesn't know what accommodation they need? That's okay. That's part of our job sometimes as the advocate to understand what the situation is and say, you know what, I think this may be helpful. What do you think? So for example, I've seen people struggle with, I have a thin pen here. I don't know if you can see, it's very tiny, right? For some individuals, they need the chunkier pencils to be able to write. So we have a variety of different pencils and pens around our office. And I can say to someone, looks like you're having a hard time grabbing that pencil. Here, try this one. I didn't make them feel bad about anything. I didn't say anything. It was just an offering of support to say, I think this may make your life a little bit easier here. So sometimes we need to notice, because not everyone knows what their rights are or what they can ask for. Because we're trained to be very compliant. We're trained to believe people in power, that they know better than me. And it's important that we are able to say to someone, what about this? What about that? I saw this, maybe it'd be helpful to you. So it's opening up that conversation that I think is the key part. Okay. For some things to consider, making sure that you have large print, easy to read, plain language material available to everybody. So when they come in, it's there. And even if you don't have like stacks of papers everywhere, you have a notice or a little, asterisk at the bottom, large print available, please ask. So again, they know that it's welcoming. When you have events or groups or any sort of poster or flyer, please always make sure that you're adding the little line, if accommodations are needed, please contact. Again, it's another way that your agency can send messaging to people to say, you're welcome here. If you leave that out, you're sending the message, you're not welcome here. We have a policy at our agency that for every virtual meeting, the closed captioning is automatically turned on. Again, universal access. No one has to ask for it. It's just always there. Please make sure that your website is screen reader available and it is high contrast. In the day and age that we live in, people are going online to seek services. They're Googling, they're searching to see what help that they can get. If they can't access your website, they can't access your services. So that's a really key component. Is your website accessible? So if you go on our website, bflnyc.org, at the bottom left hand, you will see an accessibility feature. It's a widget that will change the website for people's accessibility needs. Please make sure your hallways and offices are clear of obstructions, so people who with wheelchairs and walkers or other accessibility devices can freely get through without any tripping hazards. Sometimes lowering or brightening the lights can help people with vision impairments that they can see you better. And please allow people to bring their service animals or home health aides, because without that, they may not be able to feel comfortable or be able to access your site and your services. Okay, we only have a few minutes left. So we had two case examples. I'm going to go through the first one quickly with everybody. And then you could kind of mull over the second example amongst your teams. That's your second homework. The first example is a 19-year-old survivor of sex trafficking with a mental health disability was just accepted into your rapid rehousing program. What services and supports can be provided while they are participating in this program? What are some examples that you have? Assistance with seeing or going to apartments showing? Yeah, it can be really anxiety provoking when you're going into a new environment. So what supports can you offer them in that moment? And maybe that is going with the person that they're most comfortable with, and that could be you as their advocate. What else? Go with them or do it over the computer or phone. Yeah, providing that support. Visual support, education around how to avoid scams. Yes, thank you. That is really helpful education about what to look for when you're doing your housing search. Lease signing, understanding. Going through the process with people prior to being in the situation, knowing what to expect, how to expect it. For some individual, you need to be very detailed. Some individuals, general overview is okay with them, for them, but what will make them most comfortable in that moment? Provide them questions, prep, a lot of prep work. It takes us time from our day, right? But what's going to help them so they're most successful in that moment? Realistic expectations is very important. Right. Hold on, the chat's blowing up. Mental health referrals, resources for employment, education, so they can have housing stability. A script, yes, to make phone calls, send emails to landlords, property managers. Exactly. So when it's your first, maybe this is your first apartment that you've ever had before, being able to give people scripts and practice with them how they're going to speak with individuals, what they should say and do, that's very, very helpful, so you can prepare for the moment so they don't have anxiety. List the typical furniture, yes. So when we have a supportive housing program, and when we ask people, what kind of furniture would you like in your unit, they're like, what? I don't know, because for some individuals, again, this is their first apartment. They're not sure what they want or need. Some other things that you can do once they're in the program is that talk about triggers for them. What are some of their triggers? Because now they might have neighbors who are loud or noisy. There's a lawnmower going outside my house right now. For some individuals, that may be triggering. So understanding from them, what was that like to be in that unit by yourself for that night? Did you hear anything that made you scared or nervous? Sometimes we have safe words for individuals, because I need to understand what their mental health disability looks like for them from their perspectives. So we have safe words sometimes, and we'll say, hey, if I say this word, I'm okay. Or if I say this word, I need help. We really go into pretty deep about what a diagnosis looks for them and what that feels like. So at what point do we need to help you? At what point do I know that it's time for me to call this person? And who do you want me to call for help? And having that agreement with someone from the very beginning shows that I'm a trustworthy person. I'm not just going to call the cops on you when I see this behavior. So if I see something, who should I call? How should I help you? What are some safe words that we can communicate with each other in these moments? And really talking through how and what your housing will look like for that person. Okay. So I think we are at time. Thank you everyone for your space today, being with us. We really appreciate how interactive the chat was and being with you.
So yeah, we are at time today, and we're a little bit over, and we want to be mindful of you all's time. So we also just want to give a shout out to our presenters. This was brilliant. It was a lot of information, and I hope this information was beneficial and will be of use to you all. And we would also like to drop our presenters' contact information into the chat as well. They are open to taking questions after this presentation and getting you into contact with resources and things that you may need. A couple last things. We've already dropped a link for you to take the survey to evaluate today's webinar, and we'll be dropping that in again. It only takes 5 minutes to complete, and we do incorporate your feedback. So please let us know how we did today. And if you would like to receive a certificate of completion for this webinar, please email training@freedomnetworkusa.org. You're also able to visit our website, join our listserv, and check out our resource library. Again, thank you to our presenters, and thank you for attending today. We look forward to seeing you next time.